The first thing he remembered was the taste of dirt and blood in his mouth and the way the jungle sounded when it thought he was dead. The gunfire had faded into the distance, pushed back by the steady chorus of insects and the heavy drip of water from leaves overhead. For a long moment he didn't move. He lay face down in the mud, one arm twisted under his chest, his helmet gone, its right leg refusing to answer when his brain told it to move. Somewhere behind him, far beyond the tangle of vines and shattered branches, an AK cracked a lazy, distant shot, like an afterthought. The enemy believed it was over. They believed his unit was broken, the survivors scattered or captured, the wounded left where they fell. One more patrol erased in the jungle. One more report filed and forgotten. First Lieutenant Jack Mercer forced his right hand into the mud and pushed himself up an inch, then another. Every nerve in his body protested. A hot spike of pain shot through his side and up into his ribs, making his vision flare white at the edges. His leg was wrong. He could feel that much. Not gone, not missing, but damaged in a way that made weight feel like fire. He coughed, spat mud, and listened. The jungle answered with its usual indifference. No shouted orders. No boots crashing through brush. No friendly voices. No radio chatter. Just the soft hiss of leaves in a humid breeze and the slow drip of a world that did not care who lived or died in it. He rolled onto his back and stared up at the canopy. Green on green on green, layered so thick that the sky was nothing but a suggestion. For a second, the temptation to close his eyes and let the weight of it all pull him under was overwhelming. The last clear image he had was of his platoon moving along the narrow ridge, the point man raising a hand, and then the entire world erupting in a wall of sound and light. Claymores. At least 2, maybe 3, triggered from above them. The blast had thrown him sideways off the trail, down into the brush. He remembered tumbling, branches tearing at his uniform, his helmet ripped away, his radio handset slipping out of his grip. Then the second wave had hit automatic fire grenades. Disciplined bursts that sliced through foliage and men with equal precision. He tried to sit up. Pain lanced through his right leg, but he gritted his teeth and kept moving. When he finally managed to prop himself against the base of a tree, he looked down. His trouser leg was soaked dark from mid-thigh down to his boot. The fabric was torn where a fragment had found its way in, and the swelling around the wound told him everything he needed to know. It wasn't just a graze. Something had chewed through muscle, maybe bone. He flexed his foot experimentally. It responded, barely, like it was moving underwater. Jack sucked in a slow breath and forced his thoughts into order. He was alive. He was alone. His radio was gone. His platoon was somewhere up on that ridge, or what was left of it. The enemy had initiated a near-perfect L-shaped ambush, and if they followed their usual pattern, they would sweep the kill zone for survivors. Finish the wounded, collect weapons and documents, then melt back into the trees, if they hadn't already. He listened again. This time he heard something else. Far off, almost consumed by the jungle's constant hum, a low, rhythmic chopping sound. Helicopters. Not close enough to see him, not yet, but near enough to remind him that somewhere above this canopy there were friendly forces who still believed they had something to save. Or maybe they were just flying to another hot LZ, responding to another call, another fire mission. Either way, they were too far away to matter to a man bleeding against a tree with a leg that wouldn't work. He let his head rest back for a moment and allowed himself one sliver of memory that wasn't filled with gunfire. The briefing that morning had been routine. Route of march, likely enemy positions, recent sightings. His platoon had drawn a patrol up into the high ground west of the valley, a strip of jungle-covered ridgeline that intelligence insisted was being used as a resupply corridor. Jack had studied the map, traced the contour lines with his finger, and nodded. It looked like 100 other ridges, 100 other patrol routes. He knew the men by name, knew who complained the most about the heat, who always cracked a joke just before first contact, who watched his back without having to be asked. He also knew something else. When he'd called in their last position before the world exploded, he'd given an exact grid. Somewhere in a fire direction center, there was a note of where Lieutenant Mercer's platoon had been. When they didn't check in, when the scheduled radio call came and went with nothing but static, someone would notice. Someone would push for answers. Maybe Captain Harris. Maybe the Battalion S3. Maybe a clerk who didn't like an empty line on a chart. They would know he and his men had disappeared on that ridge. They would send someone to look. Eventually. Eventually wasn't going to stop the bleeding. It wasn't going to keep the enemy from coming back to make sure there were no loose ends. It wasn't going to get his men out. Jack reached for his canteen, took a careful sip, and then forced himself to turn his head toward the direction of the ridge. The ground sloped upward there, choked with undergrowth. Broken branches and scorched leaves marked the path of the explosion. He could see a smear of dark on one broad leaf, already turning brown at the edges. Blood. Theirs. His. It didn't matter. He could stay where he was and hope that a patrol swept low and wide, stumbling over him by accident. He could lean his head back, let the exhaustion take over, and trust that the story ended here beneath a canopy that didn't care about rank, unit, or mission. The jungle was very good at erasing paperwork. Dog tags faded fast under roots and mud. Or he could move. The choice wasn't cinematic. It didn't feel heroic. It felt like a dull, stubborn refusal to let someone else write the last line of his story. He gripped the bark behind him, bit down on a curse, and dragged his body an inch forward. The leg screamed. Fine, let it scream. The jungle didn't understand words anyway. He pulled again, using his good leg to push, elbows digging into the earth. Progress measured itself in inches. His breathing turned ragged, but he kept going. Every movement brought him closer to the ridge and closer to whatever waited there. Maybe it was a silent hillside littered with bodies and shell casings. Maybe it was an NVA security element sweeping the line. Maybe it was one of his men, half buried in brush, waiting for a voice that hadn't come. The only way to know was to get there. As he crawled, the jungle closed behind him like a wound. Leaves swung back into place. Branches hid the smear of his passage. At 10 yards, his former position vanished into the green. At 20, the tree he'd leaned against was just another trunk in a forest that was thick with them. Sweat stung his eyes. Each breath dragged humid air into lungs that felt too small. Time fractured. It stopped being measured in minutes and turned into a sequence of pulls and pushes, of pain and brief pauses. He thought of Sergeant Cole up on the line, the old NCO who'd once told him, "Sir, in this country nobody's coming to save you. Fast, you either bring yourself back or you don't come back at all." Jack hadn't appreciated the bluntness then. Now it felt like doctrine. He dragged himself toward the place where his platoon had been swallowed, the place the enemy had already decided was finished. They thought they'd left a trail of bodies behind them. They thought the lieutenant was one of them. They thought the story was over. They were wrong. He reached a point along the slope where the ground began to level out, and the smell of burned vegetation drifted toward him on the thick air, faint but unmistakable. Explosives left a signature that the jungle couldn't hide. The closer he crawled, the more details returned to him like fragments of a dream he didn't want but couldn't ignore. He remembered Garcia yelling something about movement on the left. He remembered Evans dropping into the brush when the first blast hit, his helmet rolling like a kicked stone. He remembered shouting into the radio, trying to raise higher headquarters, but the static had swallowed every word. Then the ridge had erupted in fire and discipline had dissolved into instinct. Men ducked, scrambled, fired blind. Some didn't get the chance. Jack eased himself forward until he could press one hand against a scorched branch. The wood was still brittle from heat. Shreds of fabric clung to it, an ode to green thread caught between splinters. Someone had been thrown against this tree. He forced down the heaviness rising in his chest and scanned the area. No bodies in sight. That wasn't a relief. The NVA rarely left bodies behind. Not theirs. Not theirs. They dragged away everything. Equipment, weapons, even wounded enemies. They believed in controlling the narrative. A vanishing platoon was easier to explain if no one ever found what was left. He pulled himself another yard and froze. A faint metallic clink echoed to his right. Not natural, not the jungle. A boot stepping on a spent casing. A rifle sling brushing against a metal buckle. He held his breath. The jungle stilled for half a second, then resumed its constant hum, but the clink lingered in his mind like a warning. Someone was still here, maybe more than one. They were quiet, professional quiet. The kind that came from men who'd lived in this terrain for years, the kind who could stand 10 feet away and remain shadows. He slid his hand forward and felt the dirt give way to a shallow depression. A footprint, fresh, broad heel, narrow toe, Vietnamese-issue sandal. The print pointed uphill toward the crest of the ridge toward where his platoon had been hit. If the enemy was still sweeping the area, they were either finishing their search or waiting for anyone foolish enough to come back. Either way, they were between him and whoever from his unit might still be alive. He looked down at his leg. The bleeding had slowed but hadn't stopped. Every crawl pulled at torn tissue, sending new spikes of heat up his side. If he pushed too hard, he would pass out. If he rested too long, the enemy would find him before he ever found his men. He had no weapon, no radio, no backup, and no reason to believe there was anyone left to rescue. But the possibility, the small, irrational possibility, was enough. Soldiers didn't abandon their own, not if there was even a sliver of a chance. He angled left, choosing a route that kept him under thicker cover. Vines draped over branches like ropes soaked in sweat. He pushed them aside and crawled beneath ferns taller than his shoulders. The canopy pressed low, compressing the heat until it felt like he was breathing through wet cloth. After several yards, the ground dipped into a shallow gully. He slid down with controlled movements, biting back the sound that wanted to escape his throat when his injured leg struck a root. At the bottom of the gully, he paused. The air smelled different here, damp, earthy, tinged with something metallic. He adjusted his position and spotted the outline of a helmet partially buried under leaves. Not NVA, American. The familiarity of the shape pulled at him with equal parts dread and determination. He dragged himself forward, brushed away the layer of foliage, and uncovered the helmet fully. There was a bullet crease along the rim. The inside was dirty but not blood-soaked. Whoever wore it might have survived long enough to remove it, or someone else had removed it for them. A faint track cut through the underbrush nearby, subtle but present. A drag mark. Something heavy had been pulled through here. Maybe a body. Maybe a wounded soldier. The direction was unmistakable. Down the gully, toward a narrow ravine where visibility dropped to almost nothing. If anyone from his platoon had been taken alive, the trail would lead there. He followed it with renewed urgency, biting down on the pain each time he moved. The ravine swallowed him quickly. Walls of earth rose on either side, slick with moss. Overhead, the canopy squeezed into a dark tunnel that filtered out most of the daylight. It felt like crawling into a throat that wanted to close around him. The air grew still, thick, unmoving. Even the insects seemed cautious here. The drag marks continued until they reached a widening at the ravine's base. Jack pulled himself up onto a patch of level ground and froze again, not from fear this time, but from recognition. A torn sleeve caught on a root. Dark smears on the rocks, not fresh but recent. He reached out and touched the fabric. The name tape was gone, torn away or blown off, but the stitching pattern was familiar. Uniform from his platoon, one of his men had been here. Alive or dead, he didn't know, but they hadn't been left on the ridge. Someone had moved them. He listened again, long and hard. There was something just beyond the soft hum of insects and distant tree frogs. A low rasp, like breathing forced through clenched teeth. Human. Close. He dragged himself toward the sound. Moving slowly, every sense stretched thin. The shape came into view a moment later, a figure slumped against the ravine wall, head down, chest rising just barely. Bennett, Jack whispered before he could stop himself. The man didn't respond. Jack closed the final distance and reached out, touching Bennett's shoulder. The soldier flinched violently and tried to lift his rifle, but his arm trembled and failed halfway. His eyes were glassy, unfocused, rimmed with exhaustion. But recognition flickered somewhere behind them. Lieutenant Bennett's voice cracked. "Thought you were gone." "Not yet," Jack said. The words felt heavier than the jungle itself. He took in Bennett's condition. Shrapnel along the side of the torso. A deep gash across the forearm. His breathing was shallow, uneven. He shouldn't have been alive. But he had made it this far, dragged himself or been dragged by someone else. Jack scanned the ravine again. No other bodies. No sign of who had moved him, but the trail continued past the rocks into another narrowing footprint, some deep, some rushed. "How many?" Jack whispered. Bennett swallowed hard. "Maybe. 3 of us. Don't know where Evans is. Clark. He was hit bad." Jack steadied his breathing. 3. 3 were alive long enough to move. If even one more was ahead, there was still time to reach them. Still time to bring them back. He couldn't carry Bennett. He could barely carry himself, but the ravine gave cover, and the jungle gave noise discipline. If he could get Bennett to stay conscious, if he could keep them both moving just a little farther. "They thought we were all dead," Jack said quietly. Bennett blinked, eyes heavy but determined. "Then let's prove them wrong." Jack nodded once, a grim, silent agreement. The kind that didn't need further words. He slid under Bennett's good arm, braced himself, and prepared to move again, toward the darkness ahead, toward the uncertainty. Toward whatever pieces of his unit still breathed in this unforgiving jungle. Jack steadied Bennett against the ravine wall for a moment, giving the soldier time to gather what little strength he had left. The air hung heavy around them, thick with the scent of mud, roots, and something else. Something metallic drifting faintly from deeper inside the narrowing passage. Jack recognized it instantly. Blood. Not a lot, not fresh. But enough to mean that whoever had come through here hadn't been unscathed. He didn't know if that was good news or bad. Injuries meant survival, but they also meant time was running out. They moved slowly at first, Jack dragging himself forward with one arm while keeping Bennett balanced with the other. Bennett tried to help, pushing with his legs, but every attempt sent tremors through his entire body. Jack felt each one as if they were his own. The world narrowed to the rhythm of their movement, one dragging motion. One breath, One heartbeat, each step measured against the pain he forced himself to ignore. As they progressed, the ravine walls tightened, funneling them into a narrow passage barely wide enough for them to fit through. The ground rose in uneven mounds, slippery from moisture. Jack paused when he saw a mark on the wall, a smear of dirt at shoulder height, as though someone had fallen against it and pulled themselves onward. He reached out, touching the spot lightly, feeling the damp earth crumble under his fingers. "Someone came through here not long ago," he murmured. Bennett nodded weakly. "Evans. Maybe Clark. They were ahead of me when I went down." Jack searched his memory. Clark had been hit hard when the explosion tore through the ridge. Evans had tried to pull him out of the initial blast zone. If they'd made it this far, it meant they had been moving together, helping each other the same way Jack was helping Bennett now. He adjusted his grip. "We'll find them." They pushed deeper into the ravine until it suddenly opened into a small clearing carved by ancient erosion. The clearing was dim, the canopy overhead packed so tightly that only shards of sunlight pierced through in narrow beams. The air here felt colder, untouched by the wind, as if sounds struggled to escape. Jack felt the shift immediately. It was a space that swallowed movement and amplified silence. Then he saw discarded gear scattered near the far wall. A torn rucksack. A canteen lying on its side. Blood on the strap of a helmet. The items were tossed, not placed. A sign of urgency. Jack pulled Bennett toward the gear and inspected it carefully. The helmet strap belonged to Clark. He recognized the way it had been tied. Clark always knotted it improperly, something Jack had corrected more times than he cared to remember. But there was no body. "They moved him," Jack breathed. "Who?" Bennett whispered. "The NVA?" Jack studied the area. Tracks overlapped in the soft earth, some light, some deep, some dragging. He saw the outline of NVA sandals, but also the impressions of American boots. More than one pair. The marks led toward the far side of the clearing into a steep, shadowed slope. "They weren't taken," Jack said finally. "They were escaping." Bennett exhaled shakily. "Then they're alive. Maybe, but they're hurt. And they're heading into the densest part of the valley." He knew what that meant. The valley was a maze of ravines, roots, narrow passages, and deadfall. It was easy to get lost even without being injured. It was easier still to be ambushed. The NVA used that terrain like a second skin. If Clark and Evans had gone that way, they were heading into a place where sound didn't travel, where sight lines vanished, and where survival became a matter of instinct. Jack tightened his grip on Bennett and followed the tracks. The slope forced them upward at a brutal angle. Jack's wounded leg buckled on the first attempt, and he fell forward, catching himself with his forearm. The sudden shock rattled his skull, but he forced himself upright again. Bennett tried to apologize, but Jack cut him off. "Save your strength." "I'm good." They climbed inch by inch, the jungle closing around them. Thick roots jutted from the walls like skeletal fingers. Vines hung low, brushing against their shoulders with a cold wetness that seeped into their uniforms. The air felt ancient, untouched. Jack could almost imagine how the valley had looked 1,000 years before any soldier set foot here. Halfway up the slope, he heard a faint sound, something between a cough and a gasp. He paused, raising his hand slightly in instinctive silence. Bennett stiffened beside him. The sound came again, softer this time, carried by the heavy air. Jack turned his head toward the right side of the slope. A narrow crevice split the rock face, just wide enough for a man to slip through. The sound had come from inside. He pulled Bennett closer and whispered, "Stay quiet." He maneuvered toward the crevice and peered inside. The darkness swallowed most of the view, but after a moment his eyes adjusted and he saw movement, a faint shift, slow and weak. Then he saw familiar shapes, the outline of a boot, a slumped shoulder, a rifle lying uselessly across someone's lap. He leaned in farther. "Evans," Jack whispered. A strained voice answered, hoarse and almost broken. "Sir? Thought you were dead." Jack breathed out slowly, the closest thing to relief he had felt since the explosion. "Not today." Evans dragged his gaze upward. His face was pale, covered in dirt and streaked with dried blood. His right leg was twisted at an angle that told Jack it was broken. Clark lay beside him, chest rising shallowly, his uniform soaked through from a deep wound in his side. Both men looked as though they had been hiding here for hours, maybe longer, too weak to move, waiting for a rescue that seemed impossible. Until now. Jack felt something shift inside him. Not hope, not yet, but purpose sharpening like a blade. 4 men were alive. Badly injured, but alive. The odds were impossible. The mission was insane. But the path forward was unmistakable. He whispered, "We're getting all of you out of here." Evans blinked, tears forming despite the dirt on his skin. "How, sir? We can't move." Jack tightened his jaw. "Then I'll move you." He positioned Bennett against the wall, braced himself, and prepared for the next step. An impossible step. The one no manual had ever taught. The one no commander could ever fully plan. Because this wasn't about tactics anymore. This was about bringing his men home. Jack adjusted his position inside the narrow crevice, forcing himself to ignore the fire spreading through his torn muscles. The cramped space made every movement feel heavier, as if the jungle itself were trying to hold them in place. Evans tried to shift, but the attempt triggered a sharp gasp and his head dropped back against the wall. "Don't move," Jack said softly. "Save your strength." Evans nodded weakly, jaw clenched. Clark didn't respond at all. Only a faint twitch along his jaw showed he was still hanging on to consciousness. Jack touched his neck lightly. Pulse weak, but there, a thread between life and the dark waiting around them. Jack scanned the crevice again. It wasn't deep. It wasn't safe. If the NVA swept the slope, they'd spot the entrance instantly. The men hiding here had survived by miracle, not by cover. Staying meant dying. Moving meant pain, exposure, noise, but possibility. He turned to Bennett, who watched him with hollow determination. "We're taking them up the slope. We'll use the ridge as concealment." Bennett swallowed. "Sir, you can barely move." Jack didn't argue. He braced himself, slid an arm under Clark first, and tried to lift him. The weight nearly crushed his lungs. Clark wasn't heavy, but Jack's injuries made every shift feel like pushing through stone. He exhaled slowly, repositioned, and lifted again. This time, Clark's body rose off the ground, limp as soaked cloth. Behind him, Evans managed a strained whisper. "Sir, you don't have to," Jack cut him off. "Yes, I do." Each movement was a negotiation with pain. He shifted Clark onto his back, locking the soldier's arm around his neck so the weight wouldn't slip. Clark's breathing pressed faintly against Jack's shoulder, a reminder of how fragile the thread was, how close it all was to ending. "Bennett," Jack said, forcing steadiness into his voice, "follow behind me. Help Evans however you can." Bennett nodded and crawled toward Evans, shouldering him gently. Evans bit down on the pain as his broken leg shifted, and for a moment he trembled uncontrollably. But he swallowed it, set his jaw, and forced himself upright against Bennett's support. "Ready," he managed. No one was ready, but they moved anyway. Jack pushed himself up the slope, dragging Clark's limp weight 1 inch at a time. The incline fought him, gravity pulling at every step. His injured legs shook under the strain, threatening to buckle with each push. Sweat streamed down his face, mixing with the dirt and blood smeared across his skin. The jungle's heat pressed down like a hand, suffocating, relentless. Behind him, Bennett and Evans followed with halting progress, their breaths labored, their steps uneven. But they moved. They kept moving. Halfway up, a sound ripped through the quiet, a distant rustle. Then another. Footsteps, multiple, precise, coordinated. NVA. Jack froze. Bennett held Evans still, pressing him against the slope to minimize their outline. The jungle seemed to lean in, holding its breath with them. The footsteps grew louder, moving along the upper ridge. A patrol sweeping for survivors. If they were caught here exposed on the incline, burdened by wounded men, they would be executed before they could offer a word in protest. Jack steadied his breathing. The patrol paused. Leaves shifted overhead. A voice murmured something in Vietnamese. Closed. Jack closed his eyes and held still. Seconds passed in slow motion. A bird called somewhere to the left. A branch snapped under a boot. Another murmur, another step, and then silence. The footsteps resumed, moving away this time. Farther. Fading. Only when the final sound vanished did Jack allow himself to breathe again. Bennett exhaled a shaky breath behind him. Evans leaned his head against the slope, trembling with relief or exhaustion. Jack couldn't tell which. He took the next step, then another. The ridge was only a few yards away now, but those yards felt like miles. His muscles shook uncontrollably. Clark's weight seemed to double. His vision blurred at the edges, black shadows creeping in like a curtain threatening to close. But he pushed. Finally, his hand found solid ground at the top of the ridge. He pulled himself and Clark over the edge, collapsing into the ferns. Bennett and Evans reached them moments later, both collapsing with equal exhaustion. The air was cooler up here. The wind faintly stirred the leaves overhead. The jungle seemed to breathe around them, almost welcoming, almost forgiving. Jack lifted his head. Through the gaps in the foliage, he could see a distant trace of smoke from the earlier blast site. Somewhere beyond the next ridge, the extraction zone waited, a place he wasn't sure he would see again, but a place he had to reach. He turned to the men around him. All three battered, all three barely alive, but alive. He whispered, "We're not done yet." No one answered, but their eyes said enough. Jack repositioned Clark again, braced himself on his good leg, and began the long crawl forward. The others followed in a silent line of broken men refusing to die in a place that had swallowed too many already. Hours passed. The jungle thinned. The light shifted from muted green to a pale, open brightness. Then Jack heard it, the distant thump of helicopter blades. Slow at first, then growing louder. A sound like salvation. Bennett managed a faint laugh. Evans pressed his palm over his eyes as if afraid it would disappear. Clark stirred weakly against Jack's shoulder. Jack raised his arm, waving it with what little strength he had left. The helicopter banked, shifted, then turned toward them. The wind from its rotors swept across the clearing, bending the trees. Soldiers leaned out the side door, pointing when they spotted the four figures crawling into the open. Hands grabbed them. Voices shouted orders. The world tilted, blurred, steadied. Jack felt himself lifted, felt Clark's body taken from his arms, felt Bennett and Evans pulled onto the deck beside him. He collapsed onto the metal floor, the vibrations of the aircraft rattling through his bones. For the first time since waking on the ridge, he allowed his eyes to close. He had done it. He had brought them home. Even from the edge of death, even with nothing left to give, he had led a rescue no one expected. A rescue only a soldier refusing to die could make.